Good afternoon. Happy Saturday, all. Want to continue our study of the book, The Paleo Cardiologist by Dr. Jack Wolfson. For those of you that this is your first viewing, we're going through this specific book here. Fantastic book, specifically related to natural ways to build your body to prevent risk factors of heart disease. So today is the completion of chapter 5, which is discussing the book. It says, chapter 4, it says nutrition. Where did we go wrong? So we're going to cover kind of the most commonly consumed processed foods here. So gluten, dairy, soy, pesticides, and artificial ingredients. So starting with gluten. Gluten is something that's universally accepted by both medical and holistic practitioners as having some level of a downside. I remember being very young, and my grandfather used to feed corn-fed cattle, and I remember him talking about being able to buy gluten by the ton for a very low dollar amount, so it's a cheap substance. It's also mostly present in foods that we produce large amounts of, like wheat and things like that. So for breads and cereals and cookies and all that kind of stuff. But, when you talk about gluten, they're estimating, according to this book, that about 50 to 70% of Americans are gluten intolerant. So does that mean all people are gluten intolerant? Absolutely not. But unfortunately, over 50% of people have some sort of allergic or inflammatory reaction related to gluten. So if you're one of those, you may feel it, you may not. And that's the tough part, is often the intolerance occurs internally or shows up in something that you might not link to your diet. So going back to what we've discussed in the past, the simplest things are to cut processed foods. So cutting out refined flours, cutting out breads, cutting out pastas, and eating mostly whole foods, which follows that Paleolithic diet. A couple of things that they really stress in this is, I hear this all the time in the clinic, people will say, I cut gluten, so now I'm eating gluten-free cookies or gluten-free bread, like for instance, like gluten-free pizza crust. All they've done is replace the wheat flour with corn flour, which also highly genetically modified. There's a high level of intolerance in this country to it. So going gluten-free and then eating processed gluten-free foods is probably not a whole lot better. So again, getting away from processed foods is your takeaway when you talk about gluten, gluten-free, anything in that arena. Now, dairy. So it's starting to warm up. It's finally nice outside, and though we're still under this stay-at-home order, I notice a lot more people are outside. And for those of people that have been coming into the clinic, we've seen that there's a large amount of people that are starting to express allergy-type symptoms. Now, one thing that's also been proven is there's a certain number of people that are intolerant to dairy. So this is most symptomatically linked to things like sinus congestion and allergies and asthma. And many people don't really associate the fact that they might have chronic sinus issues to the fact that they might consume a whole lot of processed dairy. So that's something to be aware of for those, whether that's for yourself or for someone you love or just a coworker or whatever. But also, especially the dairy that's most commonly consumed in our country is also linked to things like bowel issues, heartburn, diarrhea, gas, and bloating. So it can affect the processing. And why does that happen? There's a few reasons. First of all, conventional dairy is known to put a large amount of hormones. There's steroids, there's antibiotics that are all in non-organic, non-grass-fed dairy. That additionally, if you are going to consume dairy, which again, paleo is anti-dairy. I can't say that I'm 100% anti-dairy, but I will tell you the dairy that we consume is organic, free, or grass-fed and organic. I said organic twice, raw. So we don't eat a ton of milk, but we do eat raw, grass-fed, organic cheese. So again, whether you choose to completely avoid dairy or not, but again, like Organic Valley would be probably the most commercially available. You can, in some cases, find a farmer that will do raw dairy, but really, I'm a big advocate of dairy substitutes like coconut milk, almond milk, cashew milk, things like that, and then using the raw cheese as your dairy source. Now, a lot of people do consume dairy thinking that they're either getting good amounts of protein or vitamin D or calcium. And what I have to tell you is that all of those things aren't necessarily true. So because dairy, the most of the dairy consumed is ultra pasteurized or is pasteurized, essentially heated, similar to cooking meat, only about 50% of that protein is available and only about 10% of that calcium is available. So actually America is, depending on which study you read, the highest consumer of dairy. We also have one of the, if not the highest rate of osteoporosis. And why is that? Well, osteoporosis is linked to toxicity consumption, and America is notorious for consuming toxins, whether that's from medications or that's from processed foods or that's from, whatever. We are notorious for consuming processed and toxic things, which pulls calcium out of our bones, which leads to osteoporosis. So if you, going back to one of the things that we talked about very early on, if you're trying to avoid osteoporosis, from a calcium standpoint, green vegetables and red meats have good sources of calcium. Getting your vitamin D level up, so not only for your immune system, but for many other reasons, getting a whole food or a high quality vitamin D supplement to help with the absorption. So that's what vitamin D does in this arena. It absorbs calcium, or helps with calcium absorption in your body. So that is a good way. So going back to the greens drink, I'm a huge advocate of doing either green juice or a greens drink at least once a day. Right now I'm doing it twice a day personally, because it helps with all the different things that we don't even think about, including the immune system. Now, a couple of things about dairy that are important to note that are good. First of all is whey. So for instance, in the clinic, we sell a grass-fed whey protein, but whey is a very common protein source. Whey is a help to the liver's ability to produce glutathione, which is the body's natural antioxidant. It's the most prevalent antioxidant in your body, and most adult Americans are deficient in glutathione because they don't feed their liver the right things to produce it. So whey is an excellent part. Also, like I said, because raw dairy is alive, there's a lot of good stuff, calcium, protein, all that for absorption. So if you are a consumer of dairy, one thing that can help you consume it better is to consume digestive enzymes with it. Now, if you're under 5, you may have it's called lactase. It's an enzyme. So most people, if you think about breast milk, it is milk, and even when people start feeding their children milk, let's say around age 1 or through age 1 through 3 or whatever you've done for that, the body when you're young does have a higher prevalence of the ability to break down milk than it does later in life. So you become deficient, which is why this book makes a point of really trying to avoid dairy as you get older, because you have less ability to break it down. But for younger children, this is why they're better at it. Additionally, now going on to soy, processed soy is bad for you. It just is. So processed soy, there's soy protein isolate. That's a protein that's hidden in cheap foods. There's processed soy in all sorts of stuff. And processed soy, the reason it's so hard on the body is that it mimics estrogen. So when we talked about this early, when we were talking about cholesterol, estrogen is a either deficient or overproduced hormone for many, many people, and hormone imbalance is a very real thing. So soy inhibits or negatively affects estrogen, whether it's too much or too little. So that's the simplest thing. Processed soy is something that is supposed to be avoided. You can read study after study that it's just not meant for human consumption in that way, but it is very cheap, which is why it's hidden in a lot of foods. Now, outside of the foods themselves, talking about pesticides and artificial ingredients, pesticides are lower in organic food, but I'm just going to go ahead and read things that pesticides, which are being sprayed at the highest level currently on our crops because of resistance and when we have this genetic modification of these crops. So they may be sprayed and the crop may be okay, but it gets in the groundwater, it gets on the food, it absorbs into the skin. So food that you eat, the skin that was sprayed, can have higher pesticide counts. But I just want to go ahead and read you, and this is on page 54, but I'm going to read you the so glyphosate, which is Roundup. Last time I looked, there was over 12,000 active lawsuits against Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, which is showing that Roundup can cause cancer in the body. But again, going back to the book, studies find that glyphosate or Roundup increases lipid peroxidation, which means the damaged LDL that we talked about in the first two chapters, increases blood stickiness. Again, why do people take aspirin? To thin their blood. Damages the vascular endothelium, blocks mineral absorption, so over time creates deficiencies, can increase brain fog, decreases amino acid production, which is your body's way of managing quite a few different steps. Increases the risk of dangerous gut bacterial infections, and leads to formaldehyde production, which is linked with cancer and brain disease. When it comes to pesticides, the link, according to this study, which is number 60 in the back of the book, it says it's too long, but includes pesticide consumed in high levels linked to dementia, Parkinson's disease, cancer, diabetes, hormonal abnormalities, asthma, birth defects, and heart disease. So, and for those that are skeptical of organic foods, my personal position is that it's not debatable whether or not organic food is better. It is debatable on whether or not that we should produce genetically modified foods, because in areas of the world that are starving, better to consume that than to starve. But organic is certainly better. You have lower pesticides, you have lower all these other things. Lastly, artificial ingredients. So it says, the first sentence says, everyone tries to cheat the system. Now, starting the most toxic, in my opinion, is artificial sweeteners. So sweet and low, aspartame, sucralose. These are known neurotoxins. They're linked to a lot of the neurologic diseases like MS. They're linked to just some very serious things. And many people think that they're consuming, for instance, like Diet Coke or artificial sweeteners because they're avoiding sugar. But studies show that artificial sweeteners double the risk of diabetes and lipid abnormalities. Diabetes being the #1 risk factor for coronary artery disease. Studies show there's multiple studies that you can look up that show that people drinking diet soda versus regular soda actually have more weight gain. And why is that? Well, the artificial sweeteners still create an insulin imbalance. They create the release of insulin even though there's not the sugar. So the weight gain, it causes people to be hungrier. There's all sorts of things about how these affect stroke and seizures and dementia. What should you really do? Drink a greens drink, avoid artificial sweeteners, consume sugar at a minimal level if you're able to. And now I want to talk about MSG. So MSG, if you remember, like being addicted at the Chinese buffet, or kids with cheap like Kraft macaroni and cheese or hot dogs and that kind of stuff, they have MSG. MSG stimulates an addiction in the brain. But MSG is linked to damaged blood vessels, reduced antioxidant production, increased oxidative stress, which remember is linked to heart disease, damaged LDL particles, increased blood clotting, insulin resistance, and atrial fibrillation. So consuming not even the wrong foods, but the processed food with MSG in it is linked to all sorts of heart issues. Again, these studies are in the back, but they're on page 57 of the book. And now lastly, I want to talk about dye before action steps. So dyes are most linked to cancer. So when you see like in Mountain Dew, yellow number 30, and this is talking about blue number 1 and 2, cause thyroid tumors. So thyroid issues are a huge thing as people age. If you're sitting there going, I have a thyroid condition, well, consider what you've been putting in your body over the years. But it has all the different things that food coloring. Now you can get natural food coloring. You can use beetroots. They use carrot. So you can have, if for instance, food coloring. It is possible. It just costs more, but it doesn't have the side effects. Now, page 58 and 59, action plan. So I'm literally going to read this. So if you have your book, you could read this yourself. But action plan. So foods to avoid: sugar, artificial colors, flavors, and sweeteners, wheat and gluten, soy, corn, and dairy that's not grass-fed, organic, and free range, and ideally raw. Foods to limit: grains, beans, fruit, potatoes, and nightshades. Again, if you don't remember why, you need to read this because it seems like I'm going a little bit long today. But no matter what diet you follow, avoid GMO, eat organic, plenty of organic vegetables, avoid sugar. 2/3 raw is one thing that he advocates. Again, we can go into that later. Avoiding the artificial colors, sweeteners, and flavorings, which how do you do that without being a label reader? Avoid foods with labels. Avoid processed foods. Eat at home, which means you know what you have. And then if you do need digestive enzymes, there's HDL activators and other digestive enzymes that are very inexpensive, that are an easy thing to find to consume. So that's the end of chapter 4. We're going into chapter 5 starting tomorrow. Keep in mind, if you're liking what you're reading, take action. We are giving these books away complimentary, but keep in mind, information without action is meaningless. You might be smarter, but you're not healthier. You need to take action. So read the book. Don't just watch these. Read the book for yourself. Make your own notes. Again, if you want to have a complimentary book in your current client, just reply, private message me, or reply in the comments, and we'll talk to you tomorrow. Have a blessed day. See ya.